My name is Lisa, and if you're sitting down with a warm cup of coffee right now, I want you to take a second and look around your room. Look at the walls, the furniture, the quiet spaces. Now, let me ask you something that took me 18 years to finally ask myself. Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own life? Have you ever mastered the art of shrinking your voice, your presence, and your entire soul just to keep the peace for someone else? If you've ever had to earn your place at your own dinner table, or if you know the exhausting weight of trying to stay completely invisible just to keep a partner from snapping, type the word visible in the comments right now. I see you, and I know exactly what that quiet ache feels like. If you had told me how that Friday night would end, with my husband's billionaire boss holding both of my hands in front of 300 elite professionals, crying, and telling me he had spent the last 2 decades desperately searching for me, I would have looked down at my clearance rack dress and laughed right in your face. I was standing in the absolute farthest corner of that grand ballroom at the Marriott downtown. The Whitmore Group was throwing its lavish 25th anniversary gala. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, white lilies, and old money. A string quartet played something classical and incredibly costly in the background. Crystal chandeliers cast a dazzling, blinding light over rows of flawless white tablecloths, and everyone who was anyone in the corporate world was laughing, clinking champagne glasses, and performing their best lives. Except for me. I was trying to disappear into the wallpaper. It was a survival skill I had spent nearly 2 decades perfecting at every single one of my husband Richard's work events. I didn't know that in exactly 4 minutes, my entire existence was about to split cleanly into a before and an after. I didn't know that the woman I used to be, the brave, unbroken girl I had spent years burying under a mountain of compliance, was about to become visible again. Just minutes earlier, Richard had spent an hour in front of our bedroom mirror, meticulously adjusting his silk tie and rehearsing his corporate smile. He didn't look at me to appreciate how I looked. He looked at me to inspect me, like a piece of luggage he had to carry across a border. "Wear the navy dress," he had said. It wasn't a compliment, and it certainly wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive. Then, right before we walked through those heavy double doors into the blinding light of the ballroom, he pulled me aside by the appetizer table. His fingers tightened around my upper arm. Not enough to leave a bruise, but just tight enough to let me know who held the leash. He leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear, his voice dropping into that low, razor-sharp hiss he only used when he wanted to cut me down without anyone else noticing. "Please try not to talk too much tonight, Lisa," he whispered, forcing a polite smile for a passing colleague while speaking through his teeth. "These are important people. Don't embarrass me. You're just standing there like you don't belong. Smile more. Say something clever, or just stay out of the way." I looked at him, feeling that familiar, heavy ache settle deep into my chest. It was the same ache that had been there for 18 years, so constant that I had almost stopped noticing it, the way you eventually stop hearing the low, irritating hum of an old refrigerator in a quiet house. I didn't argue. I never argued. I just nodded, swallowed the lump in my throat, and stepped backward into my designated corner. I watched him instantly transform, putting on his booming laugh, touching elbows with the executives, and working the room like a man desperately auditioning for a bigger, wealthier life. I stood there alone with a glass of white wine I wasn't actually drinking, completely unaware that the chairman of the entire empire, Charles Whitmore, had just walked into the room, and that his pale gray eyes were scanning past the crowd, past the executives, past my husband, and locking directly onto me. Have you ever looked at your life and tried to pinpoint the exact moment you gave up your power? If you're sitting there thinking, "No, it happened all at once," let me tell you something I had to learn the hard way. It never happens all at once. True emotional erasure is quiet. It's patient. It's an architectural marvel of small, daily compromises that eventually bury you alive. If you've ever found yourself changing your tone of voice, your clothes, or your dreams, just to keep a partner's mood from shifting, type the word boundaries in the comments right now. Let's be honest with each other down there, because for the longest time, I couldn't be honest with myself. Standing in that corner at the gala, clutching that heavy wine glass, I had a front row seat to the masterpiece Richard had built out of my life. He had spent 18 years teaching me the difference between being useful and being wanted. To Richard, I was incredibly useful. I kept our pristine suburban house spotless. I managed the bills, ironed his corporate shirts, cooked the exact meals he liked, and stood perfectly still at company functions like a polished piece of furniture that came with his marriage license. But I wasn't wanted, not for who I actually was. I was only tolerated when I performed the version of Lisa that made him look successful to the outside world. I want to share a raw truth with you, something that still stings to admit out loud. My husband never sat me down and said, "Lisa, your thoughts don't matter, and your dreams are irrelevant." If he had been that cartoonishly cruel, I would have packed my bags years ago. No, Richard was far more cunning than that. He used the language of protection to slowly erode my identity. I remember it vividly, the subtle, systematic chipping away of my autonomy. It started during our second year of marriage, when I proudly came home with a brochure for finishing my undergraduate degree. Richard had looked up from his laptop, smiled that warm, seemingly protective smile, and said, "Oh, honey, we absolutely can't afford that right now with my career taking off. Isn't it much more important that one of us focuses completely on building a peaceful home? Let me take care of the stressful world." I believed him. I genuinely thought his refusal was a form of love, a way to shield me from stress. I didn't realize he was just cutting my financial and educational wings so I could never fly out of his cage. A few years later, when I got excited about a part-time outreach coordinator position at a local community nonprofit, he didn't forbid me from taking it. Instead, he used social shame. He raised an eyebrow over dinner and asked, "Lisa, what will my colleagues on the finance floor think if they see a woman with my last name working retail hours for pennies? It looks like I can't provide for my family. If you love me, you wouldn't humiliate me like that." So I turned the job down. I stayed at home. I poured my energy into making his life seamless, and in return, I became a shadow. Whenever we were out at casual neighborhood barbecues or dinner parties, if I dared to share an opinion on politics, books, or current events, I would instantly get the look. It was a private, sharp, corrective narrowing of his eyes that told me I had stepped out of line. Later, in the quiet confinement of our car on the drive home, he would deliver the verdict: "You're just not corporate material, Lisa. Some people are built for the intellectual world, and you're just better at, the home stuff." I swallowed that poison for nearly 2 decades, because I grew up believing that quiet women were strong women. I thought that swallowing your hurt and keeping the peace was a form of dignity. What a lie that was. It wasn't dignity, it was a slow psychological suicide. Watching him work the room at the gala, laughing too loudly at his VP's jokes, touching the elbows of senior analysts, I realized that Richard didn't love me. He loved the concept of having a wife, and he absolutely despised the reality that I was a living, breathing human being with a mind of her own. I stood there in my clearance navy dress, realizing that if I vanished from the room right that second, Richard wouldn't be sad because he missed my soul. He would only be furious because my empty spot looked bad to his boss. Take a sip of your coffee and really ask yourself this: are you in a relationship where you are valued for who you are, or are you just valued for how well you maintain someone else's comfort? Because as I stood near that appetizer table, completely invisible on purpose, the entire energy of that 300-person ballroom shifted. The loud laughter dropped into a low, reverent murmur. Heads began turning toward the grand entrance, and my heart gave a sudden, strange thud against my ribs. I followed everyone's gaze, and that's when I saw him, Charles Whitmore, the enigmatic chairman himself, walking into the room. And his eyes weren't looking at the executives. They were searching for something else entirely. If you've ever had a single moment where the entire world went dead silent around you, where everything you thought you knew about your past and your future just evaporated in a second, you know exactly what happened next. Charles Whitmore was 62 years old, silver-haired, and possessed the kind of quiet, commanding stature that naturally forced a room to yield without him ever having to raise his voice. I had heard Richard talk about him constantly over the years, always with this nauseating mixture of fear and hunger in his voice, the way ambitious, insecure men talk about the god who holds their corporate future in his hands. As the chairman moved through the crowd, he shook hands and nodded politely to the senior board members. But his eyes kept scanning past them, completely uninterested in the flattery. They kept searching, and then his gaze stopped. It landed squarely on my face. I watched something happen to that powerful man's face that I still struggle to fully put into words. It wasn't simple recognition. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost he spent a lifetime convincing himself wasn't real. He stopped dead mid-sentence with a senior vice president, completely abandoning the conversation, and began walking directly toward me across that crowded, shimmering ballroom. Not toward my husband, not toward the executives, toward me. The crowd parted automatically, the way it always does for men of immense power. I stood frozen by the appetizer table, my wine glass suddenly feeling like a lead weight in my hand. Panic surged in my throat. I genuinely wondered if I had broken some unwritten corporate rule, if my clearance rack dress was an insult to his company, or if I was about to be publicly scolded for existing too loudly. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. Up close, I could see that his pale gray eyes were brimming with thick, heavy tears. "It's you," he said. His voice was so quiet, so raw, that I could barely hear it over the string quartet. Then, without a single care for who was watching, he reached out and took my trembling hand in both of his. His voice cracked, rising just enough to cut through the room. "I've spent 20 years looking for you." In that exact instant, the entire ballroom went dead silent. I mean that literally. The elite chatter died. The string quartet kept playing, but absolutely nobody was listening to the music anymore. Every single pair of eyes in that room turned to witness the billionaire chairman of the company holding the hand of a woman nobody important had ever bothered to learn the name of. I searched his face desperately for something familiar, but my mind was a total blank. "I'm so sorry, sir," I whispered, my voice sounding thin and terrified. "I think you have me deeply confused with someone else." "No," he said, shaking his head fiercely as tears began to slide openly down his face, in front of his board members, his executives, his entire workforce. "No, I would know your face anywhere. 20 years, Lisa, and I would know you anywhere." I looked past his tailored shoulder and found Richard standing near the bar. His champagne glass was frozen halfway to his mouth. His face was drained of every single ounce of its usual arrogant confidence. He looked like a man watching his entire understanding of the world crack wide open in real time. "20 years ago," Charles said, his voice steadier now but thick, with an emotion that shook the room. "I was driving home from Charlotte on Route 9. There was a historic winter storm, the kind where you can't see 3 feet past your headlights. I hit a patch of black ice, lost control, and went straight off the road into a deep ditch. My car was completely crushed on the driver's side. I was trapped. I couldn't get the door open, and I couldn't feel my legs. A sudden violent stir hit the back of my mind, distant, blurry, and sharp all at once, like a nightmare I had forced myself to forget. I was 29 years old," Charles continued, his eyes locked on mine. "Newly divorced, drinking too much, driving too fast, because I honestly didn't care if I lived or died that year. I thought I was going to bleed to death in that freezing ditch. And then there was a woman. She had been driving in the opposite direction, spotted my taillights at a strange angle, and she stopped. The blurry memory in my brain instantly snapped into razor-sharp focus. A grueling double shift. The smell of cheap coffee and grease. the freezing rain hammering the cracked windshield of my old beat-up Honda. She climbed down into that muddy, freezing ditch in the pouring rain, Charles told the silent room, his grip tightening on my hand. She was in her diner work uniform, no coat. She pried that crushed metal door open with her bare, bleeding hands. She dragged me out. She held pressure on a massive gash on my head, with her own winter scarf the entire ambulance ride because I wouldn't stop bleeding, and she refused to let go of me. At the hospital, she stayed in the waiting room until the doctors confirmed I was stable enough for emergency surgery. She is the literal reason I am standing in this room tonight. I felt the polished ballroom floor tilt beneath my feet. I was 23 years old back then. I had been working the brutal night shift at a diner outside Charlotte just to pay for community college classes during the day, still desperately holding on to the fragile idea that my life might go somewhere. I remembered that storm. I remembered the car folded like a soda can. I remembered leaving the hospital before he ever woke up because my next shift started at 6 in the morning, and my mother desperately needed my help to pay the rent. I only ever had a first name, Charles said, his voice dropping into a plea. Lisa. That's all you signed on the emergency admission form so they would treat me. Lisa, no last name. I woke up, you were gone, and I spent months searching every diner within 50 miles. Years later, once I finally built my wealth, I hired private investigators. But Lisa is a common name, and you had left absolutely no trail. I never found you. I didn't think it mattered, I whispered honestly. It was the hinge my entire life turned on, Charles said, his voice echoing in the absolute silence. I built this entire empire in the years after that accident, Mrs. Walker. Every major decision I made as a man who understood he had been given a second chance by a beautiful stranger who wanted absolutely nothing in return. I looked for you for 2 decades because I never got to say thank you. Take a breath with me here, because this is where the dynamic completely shifted. I became fully aware of the crowd again, of the camera phones quietly rising in the back, and of Richard, who was staring at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He was realizing that the quiet, invisible woman he had spent 18 years minimizing was the foundational myth of the company he served. If you've ever watched a master manipulator realize they are losing control of a narrative, you know it is a terrifyingly fascinating thing to witness. They don't scream, they don't panic. Instead, their brain works at lightning speed to find a way to twist the reality so they can still come out looking like the smartest person in the room. If you know exactly what it's like to watch someone try to rewrite history right in front of your face, type the word truth in the comment section below, because that is exactly what my husband tried to do next. Richard didn't stay frozen by the bar for long. He was a corporate climber, a man who had built his entire career on perception, optics, and flawless presentation. I watched him swallow his shock, set his glass down with a practiced calmness, and smoothly step forward into the clearing. He adjusted his tailored jacket, forced a light, booming chuckle, and walked right up to the chairman's side, completely ignoring how his own face had been a deep, panicked shade of crimson just seconds before. Well, Charles, Richard said, his voice carrying beautifully through the hushed room, dripping with an artificial, warm camaraderie. I must say, life certainly works in mysterious ways, doesn't it? 20 years. And to think, my lovely Lisa here has been sitting right at my dinner table this whole time. He looked at the surrounding board members and let out another easy laugh, trying to forcibly shift the room's energy from stunned reverence back into a casual, light-hearted corporate anecdote. You know how she is, Charles. She's incredibly modest, never wants the spotlight on her. She's so focused on managing our home that she probably just forgot to mention the whole thing over the years. A lot happens in 2 decades. She forgot that she saved the chairman's life. The voice cut sharply through Richard's performance. It didn't come from Charles. It came from the middle of the crowd. I recognized it instantly. It was Dave Marsh, one of Richard's senior colleagues from the corporate finance floor. Dave wasn't a loud man, but he was highly analytical, and he was someone Richard had spent years complaining about over dinner, calling him a threat, a ruthless climber, and a corporate suck-up. But Dave wasn't trying to cause a scene. He was simply stating out loud the massive, glaring, logical gap that every single person in that room was currently thinking. Richard's corporate smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes flashing with a cold, desperate fury before he quickly recovered. Well, Dave, as I said, Lisa isn't one for dramatic stories, Richard shot back, his tone smooth but his eyes narrowing as he turned his gaze to me. It was the look, but magnified 100 times. It was a silent, razor-sharp warning disguised as a loving glance. Don't make this worse for me. Play along. Keep your mouth shut. She prefers to leave the big professional worlds to me, and frankly, I've always protected her from that kind of stress. Clearly, Charles said. The chairman's voice wasn't loud, but the word landed like a heavy iron weight. The warmth completely vanished from his pale gray eyes as he looked at Richard. Charles was a billionaire who had built a global logistical empire. He hadn't achieved that by being easily fooled by mid-level corporate smooth talkers. He read people for a living, and he had just spent the last 5 minutes observing the stark, painful contrast between my genuine, quiet shock and my husband's desperate, narcissistic damage control. Which makes it all the more remarkable, Charles continued, his tone dropping into a cold, clinical executive register that made the surrounding board members instantly stiffen, that she never once used an act of literal life-saving heroism to secure a single thing from anyone. Not money, not recognition, not even a thank you card. That is an extraordinary level of integrity, Richard. That is the exact kind of rare character most companies would kill to have walking their halls. And you've had her sitting across from you for 18 years. Before Richard could construct another clever pivot, Charles completely turned his back on him, effectively shutting him out of the conversation. He offered me his arm, his expression softening back into deep, respectful gratitude. Mrs. Walker, would you do me the absolute honor of joining me at the head table tonight? I've waited 20 years to properly thank the woman who gave me my life back. I'd like the chance to start doing that tonight. I looked at his offered arm, then I looked at Richard. My husband was standing completely isolated in the center of his colleagues, his chest heaving slightly beneath his expensive suit, his pride publicly fractured in front of everyone whose opinion he had spent his entire adult life chasing. He had just been quietly, elegantly, and publicly set aside. And for the first time in 18 years, I didn't feel the urge to shrink myself to protect his fragile ego. I reached out, placed my hand firmly on Charles's arm, and allowed him to lead me toward the stage, while 300 people watched in absolute awe. If you've ever had to sit in a small, enclosed space with a narcissist whose public image was just completely shattered, you know that the silence is far heavier than any shouting match. It's a toxic, pressurized silence that fills the car like carbon monoxide, making it hard to breathe. If you've ever sat in a car after a family event, holding your breath while your partner grips the steering wheel so hard their knuckles turn white, type the word "free" in the comments right now. Because that drive home was the night I finally realized that my cage door wasn't locked. It never had been. The moment the heavy glass doors of the parking structure shut out the rest of the gala guests, Richard let go of his polished corporate mask. He didn't yell. His voice dropped into that low, freezing, venomous whisper that he used when he wanted to completely paralyze my confidence. "What the hell was that, Lisa?" he muttered, staring straight ahead as he violently yanked the car out of the parking slot, the headlights sweeping across the empty concrete walls. "You couldn't have mentioned that you knew Charles Whitmore? 18 years of marriage, and you just conveniently forgot to tell your husband that you saved his boss's life? You made me look like an absolute idiot in front of the entire finance floor. Do you understand the damage you've done to my career tonight?" I didn't know his last name, Richard, I said, and as I spoke, I felt a strange, unfamiliar steadiness in my own voice. It surprised me. It didn't have that shaky, pleading quality it usually had when he was angry. I met a dying man in a freezing ditch 20 years ago. I didn't file the story away in a ledger for future corporate leverage. I helped a human being because it was the right thing to do. Don't play innocent with me, he snapped, his knuckles turning white on the steering wheel. A billionaire like Charles Whitmore doesn't break down weeping in a ballroom over a random diner waitress from 2 decades ago, unless there was something more to it. What really happened that night, Lisa? What aren't you telling me? If this turns into some kind of trashy office gossip, if people start talking about my wife and the chairman, it reflects entirely on my professional standing. You've put everything I've built at risk. If my promotion next month falls through because of this theatrical little stunt, you are going to deeply regret it. I looked out the passenger window at the passing city lights, watching them blur into long, glittering streaks against the dark glass. I didn't answer him. For the remaining 30 minutes of the drive, I stayed completely silent. But it wasn't the heavy, terrified silence of a woman trying to shrink herself to avoid a blow. It was the clinical, detached silence of an observer. I was finally looking at Richard clearly, stripped of the fear and the habit of compliance, and I realized something profound. He wasn't a strong man. He was incredibly fragile. He was a terrified, desperate little boy who had built a massive fortress of arrogance to hide his own mediocrity. The next 3 weeks became my masterclass in silent preparation. Richard expected me to cry, to apologize, or to frantically try to fix his mood. Instead, I did nothing but watch and plan. While he was at the office, desperately trying to manage the fallout on the finance floor, I quietly went to work behind the scenes. I didn't consult a marriage counselor. I consulted a high-level forensic accountant and a family law attorney. For years, Richard had handled all the finances, giving me a strict allowance and constantly reminding me how expensive it was to keep a house running on a single income. But as my attorney pulled our tax transcripts and property records, the reality looked completely different. Our home wasn't solely his. It was fully marital property. The secret stock portfolios he had built over 18 years were legally half mine. The architecture of my erasure had extended to our bank accounts, but the law didn't care about his corporate narrative. The law only cared about numbers. But the real twist, the piece of logic that completely flipped the board, didn't come from my attorney's office. It came from the top floor of the Whitmore Group. Charles Whitmore's curiosity about the woman who had saved his life hadn't stopped at the Gala head table. Once he discovered that the anonymous diner waitress was married to a mid-level manager in his own logistics division, he didn't blindly offer Richard a promotion out of gratitude. Charles was an elite executive. He knew that the husband of a woman with that level of profound integrity would either match her character or exploit it. So, he quietly ordered his senior compliance and internal audit teams to run a deep, comprehensive review on Richard's entire regional department. What they uncovered over those 3 weeks wasn't a loud, cartoonish crime. It was a calculated, intelligent, and deeply fraudulent corporate pattern. Richard hadn't been climbing the corporate ladder through pure talent. For 3 years, he had been systematically taking the complex, cost reduction data models generated by a quiet, brilliant junior analyst on his team and formatting them under his own name to secure his promotions. Not only that, but he had been padding his regional expense reports, billing the company for expensive weekend getaways that he claimed were client dinners, all while telling me we couldn't afford my community college tuition. The truth has a beautiful, devastating way of moving slowly until it hits all at once. By the 3rd week, the internal compliance audit hit Richard's desk like a tidal wave. He wasn't facing a promotion anymore. He was facing an official, high-stakes human resources investigation that could completely destroy his professional life. If you have ever reached that exact point in your life where a person's manipulative words no longer have any power over your mind, you know it feels like a sudden rush of cool, clean air. The threats that used to make your heart race suddenly sound like nothing more than pathetic, desperate noise. If you've ever had to look at a partner who spent years making you feel small, only to realize that they were the small one all along, type the word exposed in the comments right now. Because that Tuesday evening in our kitchen was the final definitive hour of my 18-year sentence. Richard came home late, well past 8 o'clock. The arrogant, fast-talking corporate climber who had adjusted his tie in the mirror 3 weeks ago was completely gone. His expensive suit jacket was wrinkly, slung carelessly over his arm, and his face was a pale, hollow gray. He walked into our immaculate kitchen, carrying a plastic sleeve of cheap grocery store carnations. It was a classic, desperate tactic I recognized instantly, the hurried peace offering of a man who didn't actually regret breaking something, but desperately needed a shield to stop the consequences from hitting him. He set his keys down with a shaky hand and thrust the flowers toward me, an artificial, trembling apology already forming on his lips. "Lisa, honey," he started, his voice completely lacking its usual booming authority. "I've just been under an unimaginable amount of pressure at the office lately. With this brutal HR audit. I know I've said some incredibly tense, unfair things to you over the last few weeks. You know I don't actually think you did anything wrong at the gala. I was just stressed about the optics." I looked down at the carnations, then up at his frantic, shifting eyes. "Are you bringing me these flowers because you suddenly care about how much you've hurt me, Richard?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely calm, entirely level. "Or are you bringing them because your HR hearing is tomorrow morning, and you're absolutely terrified that the chairman is going to ruin you?" His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He didn't answer fast enough, and that silence told me everything I already knew. He dropped the flowers onto the granite countertop and stepped closer, his hands reaching out in a pleading gesture that felt deeply pathetic. "Lisa, you have to listen to me. I need you on my side right now. If HR terminates me over these ridiculous expense discrepancies, we lose everything. The house, the status, the retirement. When I walk into that corporate headquarters tomorrow, I need people to see that our marriage is rock solid. I need you to come with me. If Charles sees you standing right next to me, supporting me, he'll drop the audit. He owes you his life, Lisa. You can use that. Just play the part of the devoted wife for one day, for my career." It was a profound, nauseating revelation. Even at his absolute rock bottom, stripped of all his power, Richard was still incapable of seeing me as a human being. He didn't want my comfort. He wanted me to perform. He was still asking the ghost he had spent 18 years creating to step back into the light, just to act as a decorative shield for his fraud. "No," I said quietly. "What do you mean, no?" he stammered, a flash of his old, ugly anger flickering across his face. "If I go down, you go down with me. You can't embarrass me like this." I walked slowly over to the kitchen table, reached into my pocket, and pulled out my wedding ring. I placed it gently on the center of the polished wood. The gold caught the warm kitchen light, 18 years of quiet suffering reduced to one small, metallic click. "I didn't embarrass you, Richard," I said, looking him dead in the eye, my voice entirely steady. "I exposed you. Those are two completely different things, and I think somewhere deep down inside your soul, you've always known the exact difference. You built a life where I existed to make you look good at parties and disappear into the wallpaper the rest of the time. Well, the wallpaper is gone. Good luck at your hearing tomorrow." I turned around and walked up the stairs, leaving him standing entirely alone in the kitchen, staring down at the empty gold band. The next day, the compliance team delivered their verdict. Richard wasn't completely ruined or sent to prison. The corporate world rarely works with that kind of cinematic drama. Instead, he was stripped of his management title, demoted to a low-level administrative desk in a small windowless office on the lower floor, and given a severely diminished salary. He was forced to live with the exact mediocrity he had spent his entire life trying to escape, with absolutely no audience left to charm and no wife left to blame for his failures. If you have ever packed your entire life into a few cardboard boxes, walked into a space that was entirely yours, and realized that nobody was coming home to judge you, you know that true peace doesn't sound like a roaring crowd. It sounds like the quiet, rhythmic drip of a leaky kitchen faucet that you finally have the time and the freedom to fix yourself. If you are currently standing in your own new beginning, or if you are desperately gathering the courage to finally take that first step into the unknown, type the word liberated in the comments right now. Let's create a wall of strength down there for anyone who needs to know that starting over isn't the end of your story. It's the absolute beginning. I didn't run into Charles Whitmore's arms the week I left Richard. I want to be completely honest with you about that, because it would be the easy cinematic story to tell, the neat little romantic bow to tie on a lifetime of trauma. But real life doesn't work that way, and real healing requires space. Instead, I used my legal share of our split assets to move into a modest, bright one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town. The first night I spent there, sitting on a second-hand sofa surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, I felt an overwhelming sense of vertigo. For 18 years, my mind had been constantly racing, anticipating Richard's moods, calculating how to speak, how to dress, and how to exist without causing a storm. Now, the silence was absolute. There was no judgment. There was no private corrective look waiting for me from across the room. I spent the first few months doing nothing but learning the contours of my own identity. I started drawing again, filling cheap notebooks with charcoal sketches, an old passion Richard had mocked as a childish waste of time. I bought books I wanted to read, cooked meals only I enjoyed, and slowly realized that the brave 23-year-old girl who had climbed into a freezing ditch 20 years ago hadn't died. She had just been waiting patiently for me to give her permission to come back. The divorce took exactly 4 months to finalize. Richard didn't fight me on the division of property, not because he had found a sudden sense of generosity, but because he was too consumed with trying to survive his new, humiliating reality at the office to expend any energy on destroying me. Charles respected my boundaries perfectly. He didn't flood me with expensive gifts or overwhelming attention. He understood that gratitude can easily feel like an obligation if it's pushed too hard. Instead, our paths crossed naturally a few months later through a foundation his company funded, a dedicated outreach program that provided housing, legal aid, and professional retraining for women rebuilding their lives after leaving controlling or emotionally abusive marriages. When Charles first asked me to visit the facility, I hesitated. Stepping into the public eye felt terrifying. But the moment I walked those halls and looked into the eyes of women in their 30s, 50s, and 60s who were all struggling to find their lost voices, something inside me clicked. It wasn't charity. It was profound recognition. I started volunteering. I helped organize creative workshops, and slowly I began sharing pieces of my own story. I didn't perform it. I just offered it raw and honest to women who desperately needed to hear that being quiet isn't the same thing as being strong. Within a year, the board asked me to become a director for the foundation. My old, paralyzing fear of taking up space in a room was completely replaced by a steady, unbreakable sense of purpose. Charles and I built our own relationship on that exact same slow, unhurried foundation. We had casual dinners, spent hours talking on the phone about ordinary days, books, and the weather. For the first time in my adult life, a powerful man looked at me and valued my soul, not my utility. 9 months after the gala, the foundation held its annual benefit dinner in a grand ballroom that looked remarkably similar to the one where my entire life had shattered open. But this time, I wasn't hiding in a corner, trying to disappear into the wallpaper in clearance navy. I stood confidently at the mahogany podium, wearing a deep emerald green dress I had chosen entirely for myself. I looked out at the crowd of hundreds of people, finding Charles sitting in the front row. His eyes were steady on mine, filled with a profound pride that carried absolutely no sense of ownership. I leaned into the microphone, my voice carrying clear, resonant, and entirely unshaking through the grand room. For 18 years, I told the silent audience, I believed that swallowing my hurt was a form of dignity. I thought that shrinking my presence to keep the peace was what it meant to keep a home together. It took a stranger from 20 years ago walking back into my life to remind me that real strength isn't staying quiet to preserve a lie. Sometimes true strength is finally standing up and letting the entire world hear your name. The applause that followed didn't feel like flattery. It felt like a deep, collective sigh of relief from dozens of women in that room who understood exactly what those words had cost me to say out loud. After the speeches concluded, Charles found me near the edge of the terrace, handing me a glass of champagne with a small, hopeful smile. "Would you do me the honor of having dinner with me this weekend, Lisa?" he asked softly. Not because of what happened on Route 9 20 years ago, but simply because I would love the privilege of knowing the incredible woman you've chosen to become. I looked at him, feeling a deep, beautiful warmth settle into my chest that had absolutely nothing to do with debt, rescue, or fear. This time I said, smiling back, "You don't have to look for me. I'm right here." If my story moved you even a little bit tonight, I would love to know where in the world you are watching from. Leave a comment down below and share your own journey of becoming visible. And if you believe that every quiet person deserves the chance to finally be seen for who they truly are, hit that subscribe button because we have so many more stories just like this one waiting to be told. And I don't want you to miss a single one. Take care of yourselves out there, and I'll see you in the next story.